While being as optimized as you possibly can be helpful in all content in Final Fantasy XIV, it is safe to say that there is a lot of content where it doesn't really matter. However, once we start to get into the harder content like Extremes and Savage, knowing how to make the most of your toolkit can be incredibly helpful. I want to go over a few specific, and more general, tips for improving your play in hard content. Knowing these kinds of tricks can help you get more consistent results, but remember that it doesn't have to be perfect. Knowing the kinds of tricks other roles use for their optimization can also help you to better understand how a team can work better together, which can sometimes also serve as the explanation for why you're recommended to do things in a certain way, which is also incredibly helpful in harder content. If you have some tips for improving your play in a more coordinated group setting, please do let me know in the comments. With that, number 1. Tanks and pulling. In casual difficulty content, the typical approach is that the tank simply charges at the boss at some point, and exactly how you go about it doesn't really matter. But once you get into harder content, there are a few steps to pulling effectively as a tank. The first step, which I generally recommend, is to send a ready check before anything else. You can do this either by writing /ready check in the chat, or by opening the party menu and choosing ready check from there. Once you know everyone is ready, you can move on to the next step. I personally prefer to send a ready check before every pull, but understandably, some players may find that a bit excessive, so find out what makes sense for you here. The next step is the pull timer. Once everyone is ready for combat, a pull timer is set so everyone knows exactly when to go, so everyone lands their initial attack at the same time for optimal coordination. To send a pull timer, you can either write /countdown followed by a number indicating the length of the pull timer, or use the countdown option from the party menu. Personally, I prefer to have a macro for the pull timer with a pull timer I frequently use. Common pull timers are typically 10 seconds and around 16 seconds. If you're not sure which one you should use, then I recommend using 16 seconds, as the reason for the 16-second pull timer comes down to certain jobs heavily benefiting from that longer pull timer. For instance, Samurai wants to use Make Your Shisui 14 seconds before fighting starts, and dancers want to use Standard Step 15 seconds before. Most other jobs don't need that much, hence why a 10-second timer is often used simply so everyone has enough time to prepare themselves for combat. As the timer counts down, you should make sure you know what you are supposed to be setting up before fighting starts. For instance, a barrier healer may want to set up a barrier. For tanks, it is particularly crucial that your initial attack lands as close to exactly on 0 as possible. And you may need to look up the exact recommended timing for your job to coordinate this. Now, an important detail here is that just because you are a tank doesn't mean the ready check or the pull timer is necessarily your job. It is not uncommon to let the tank tanking first, often referred to as the main tank, do both of these things, but it doesn't have to be them. It could be the second tank or the party leader that does both things. You, of course, have to react to the pull timer just the same though. And speaking of pulling, exactly how a tank goes about doing this can vary a bit between tank jobs. Let's take Warrior as an example. Your first GCD will typically be either Tomahawk or Heavy Swing, but exactly which one depends a bit on the fight itself. The two pulling methods that are commonly used I will refer to as ranged pulling and face pulling, and they each serve a different purpose. Ranged pulling is the more systematic way of pulling. As the timer goes down, you land Tomahawk as the timer hits 0, and then you wait a moment with approaching, placing yourself such that as the boss approaches you, it will end up somewhere around the center of the arena. If you can make sure it is very slightly south from the center, that is often advantageous. This is because many Extreme and Savage bosses will turn towards the center, jump there, and then face north, or sometimes south, as they start a mechanic. By placing the boss in the center, slightly south, and facing them north, the boss will barely move at all as all this happens, which helps your melee players immensely with their positionals. Some bosses will instead perform their first mechanic or two from wherever they happen to be, which can make it even more crucially important the boss is placed consistently in the center in case the mechanic requires clock positions, for instance. An extra safety measure you can use while pulling is to weave Provoke right after Tomahawk, as it generates a ridiculous amount of enmity, which gives you a stronger head start over your co-tank, just to be sure. So, in summary, on pull, you use your ranged attack such that it lands when the timer hits 0, then position yourself such that the boss will reach the center naturally by approaching you, and then run through the boss to turn them north. The other pulling strategy, face pulling, serves two specific purposes. The first one is on fights where the boss will jump to the center for their mechanic anyway, so it doesn't really matter that they're not in the center initially. But on top of that, a mechanic comes up early enough that it will mess up your opener, and simultaneously, skipping the initial GZD of, say, Tomahawk could allow you to circumvent this. Then this is a way to slightly optimize. However, the slightly less consistent positioning of the boss as a result of this can confuse the melees a bit, so it might not be optimal overall. Depends on your group. The other purpose of face pulling is, for example, if the boss is absolutely not going to the center for their first move, but rather north, for example. In those cases, pulling the boss in such a way that they stay closer to their initial position can be more beneficial. The way the face pull is performed is a couple seconds before the pull starts, you sprint and then run at, and typically through, the boss such that you engage combat with the boss as the timer hits 0. If you feel confident in your consistency in pulling in this way, you can simply run at the boss and use your first GCD, for example Heavy Swing or Keen Edge, once you are in range to do so. If you feel a bit less confident, you can use Provoke when the timer hits 0, then followed by your melee GCD for a very slight delay. I believe both Paladin and Dark Knight have reasons to prefer to open with a ranged attack anyway, which makes them perhaps slightly less preferable for face pulling in general, but that doesn't prevent them from doing it, not at all. Just in the current raid tier right now, M1S and M2S are bosses where ranged pulling is the preferred approach. M3S can go either way as the face pulling method is used for the damage optimization reasons. And M4S is best done with face pulling as the boss moves further north in short order. Number 2. Tanks and not holding defensives. In hard content like Extremes and Savage, the attacks a tank needs defensive cooldowns for are often quite regimented and planned out. You probably know long before it happens that you will need, say, your 40% cooldown or an invuln for this mechanic. This often leaves most of your other defensive cooldowns free to be more flexible. Savage bosses especially have a tendency to auto-attack like small dump trucks, so just reducing the damage of those auto-attacks can be incredibly helpful. To give a specific example, M1S has 3 tank busters and ultimately about 4 things in total that tanks need to heavily mitigate in one way or another over the course of the fight. This includes raining cats. Because of how spaced out these situations are, invulns can cover most of them, leaving nearly all other defensive cooldowns completely free to be used for reducing other damage. The highest taken option among them being the various sections in the fight where the boss will auto-attack 4 to 5 times in a row, which does about the same damage combined as one tank buster hit. As a main tank, this gives you a lot of small opportunities to use your 40% cooldown or Rampart or your other job-specific cooldowns to reduce damage, and just cycling them a bit like an AoE pull in a dungeon is not a bad idea. Just try to make sure you aren't cycling them while the boss isn't attacking you anyway. As an off-tank, making frequent use of your shareable mitigation like Nascent Flash or Intervention can also greatly reduce the work for your healers. The difficult part is that in these fights, the bosses will pelt you with auto attacks at the weirdest of times, so Sometimes you will find yourself near death while focusing on something completely different. The important advice here is to cycle through your defensive cooldowns while you're actively taking damage, making gradual use of all defensive cooldowns you know you won't need later. This advice can also apply to healers. For example, a white mage could put Divine Benison or Aquaveil on the main tank whenever auto attacks are incoming for a similar effect. Speaking of healers, number 3. Healers and healing spells. Most good healing guides will likely try their best to teach you either that healing spells, as opposed to abilities, should be used incredibly sparingly, or in some cases, not at all if you can help it. These are goals to aim for when mastering a difficult fight, but when initially learning a fight like this, it isn't a bad idea to be a little more aggressive with these kinds of spells. A notable thing to keep in mind with this is that these healing spells should not overshadow your healing abilities, but rather supplement them. While learning, it is likely both you and your team will be hit a lot harder by dealing with mechanics worse than intended, and sometimes being hit by avoidable damage. As you learn to coordinate these things better, you will need these healing spells less and less, but while you're still learning the fight, casting an extra party barrier or an extra party healing spell isn't too bad. While we are on the subject, the maximum damage gearing for healers always involves direct hit materia. However, as direct hit does not increase your healing done, replacing these direct hit materia with determination, where possible, or even spell speed, will help you a bit with the healing, which sometimes can make the difference between life and death. In the case of determination, the power difference is so incredibly small that the healing gain is absolutely worth it if it can make a difference. Number 4. True North. Positional bonuses are, overall, a relatively small amount of your total damage as a melee DPS. However, getting the positional right on your GCDs can add up to around 10% more damage from that specific attack. And, well, imagine you had a damage buff that increases your damage by 10% for one attack. That is pretty impactful, right? So at least trying to get your positionals right can add up to quite a lot over the course of a fight. However, getting all the positionals right is not always possible, either because of mechanics or due to you needing to be somewhere specific for other reasons. However, True North, as we know, automatically succeeds positionals. This can sometimes end up being used aggressively for laziness, and then you're missing True North for mechanics where you can't get the positional otherwise. The advice here is to try to get your positionals manually as consistently as you can, and to only rely on True North when you have to. You will of course over time figure out timings where you have True Norths to spare, which you can use just for an easier time. A particular example of where True North may be a good call is during Witch Hunt on M4S. As the clock spots are rather strict, you can easily die as a result of greeting your positional just a little bit, which makes True North a perfect option for this section of the fight. An additional detail to this kind of optimization is that some melee DPS jobs have the ability to adjust their rotation so that certain positionals come up at certain times. For instance, right after spending their sense, a samurai can somewhat choose whether their back positional is GCD number 3, 5, 6 or 8, their flank positional is 3, 5, 6 or 8, or their no positional is 2, 5 or 8. So, if you know a specific positional will be more convenient at those times, you can plan for that and save True North. To be perfectly clear, this kind of flexibility mainly applies to Samurai, Reaper and Ninja in different ways, but Viper has a few ways to choose when they push their somewhat fixed part of their rotation along too. Number 5. Cast times and exaggerated movement. This applies to all jobs with cast times, but certainly applies to mage, DPS and healers more frequently. The advice here is that if you know you have to move to a certain spot within, say, 10 seconds, there is no reason for you to drop everything you're doing and sprint over there unless it will actually take you 10 seconds to sprint over there. Of course, when initially learning the mechanic, prioritizing doing the mechanic right is most important, but once you figure out how the mechanic works, start to rely more on options like slide casting, or alternatively planning some instant options so you can keep up the attack as you reposition. Another thing you can do, and this one applies to all jobs, is that once you know approximately where you need to stand, you can exaggerate your movement a bit less and stand closer and closer to exactly where you need to stand. This can sometimes enable melee jobs to keep more uptime, and for caster jobs to spend less time moving in general. Taking this a step further for melee jobs, knowing exactly when the attack snapshots to hit you can allow you to step out in the very last moment and step back as early as possible, which can save you a bit of time as well. This kind of optimization can be very dangerous and scary though, and is under most circumstances perhaps excessive, but is something you can explore. Melee jobs with good ranged options like Viper can also simply choose to make use of those instead of taking these risks. Number 6. Quote-unquote complex defensive cooldowns. This one applies to all jobs and roles, however, tends to be a more important tip for DPS jobs. Every job in the game has at least one defensive cooldown. Making use of Feint or Addle when a raid wide is incoming is always more helpful than not using it. Always. Yes, if someone happened to overlap with yours, it goes to waste as 2 feints will not stack. Yes, there might be a better time to use it, but when learning a fight, simply using your defensive when an opportunity presents itself is a good starting point. After that, you can always figure out later if you need to move it around. If you hold your defensive cooldown until 4 minutes and 25 seconds into the fight where you need it, you lost out on at least 2 uses in the earlier parts of the fight, and the easiest way to determine in a fight whether you have to hold it or not is if you use it at first and then know that Feint is on cooldown where you actually needed it because of when you chose to use it before. The advice is, unless something else is decided beforehand, consider using your defensive option at the first good opportunity. You can always adjust it later down the line. For tanks, this also applies to reprisal, and again, for everyone, being somewhat consistent with when you use yours can also enable your co-tank or co-DPS to adjust theirs so you don't overlap as much if that is ever a problem. A simple example my static uses is that either me or my co-tank will use reprisal for every instance of a specific kind of repeating mechanic. For example, every brutal impact. This can free up the other tank to use their reprisal for other things that might be helpful. Another step to this is single target defensive options. Like we talked about earlier for healers, the boss is winding up a tank buster hitting both tanks and they're not going to be using invulns. Who do you give Aquaveil? Who do you give Exaltation? Who do you give Haima? Who do you give Protection? And the worst case is that you end up choosing neither. A simple tip here, for example, is to put Aquaveil on the main tank, and if you determine they absolutely didn't need it, and the other tank may have benefited more, you can always try that on the next pull. And if neither needed it, you can always give it to the main tank, as that might mean they feel a bit safer for the possible auto attacks that follow. Just to reiterate, the advice here is that if you have defensive cooldowns you don't know when to use, try and use them very aggressively, whenever there is an opportunity where it makes sense. The worst that can happen is that you won't have the cooldown when you need it later, and that is the perfect way to figure out that that was when you should have used it. So, do you have some tips for improving in hard content? I would love to hear about them in the comments. Obviously, most of this advice can also help in casual content, but admittedly, a lot of it feels extremely excessive in those contexts. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, just like players applying dots snapshot yours and your target's state to determine the damage on application, this also applies for enemies applying dots to you. This means that if a raid wide or a tank buster happens to have a dot attached to them, It is important to mitigate the initial hit with damage reduction, as it also reduces the total damage of the dot itself, and once the dot is applied, it's a little too late to apply mitigation.